First complaint arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly inside an official envelope decorated with the familiar blue logo of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. It was addressed to Amelia Carter, a quiet woman in her late 30s who had lived in the neighborhood for almost 4 years without receiving so much as a warning. She had always been the kind of resident every HOA claimed to appreciate. Her lawn was trimmed every Saturday. Her flower beds changed with the seasons. Garbage bins disappeared from the curb before sunset. Her porch lights matched community guidelines, and her home looked almost identical to every other carefully maintained property on Maple Ridge Drive. Yet that morning, everything changed because of one dog. The letter described the animal as an unauthorized large pet that violated neighborhood regulations restricting dog size and breed classifications. According to the HOA, Amelia had 10 days to permanently remove the animal from the property or face escalating daily fines. The board believed they were enforcing community standards. What they failed to understand was that Atlas wasn't a pet. Atlas was a service dog. More importantly, Atlas wasn't merely helping Amelia live comfortably. He was helping her survive. From the outside, Amelia looked perfectly healthy. She smiled politely when neighbors waved. She carried groceries without assistance. She walked to her mailbox every afternoon with Atlas calmly at her side, his golden coat glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Invisible illnesses have always confused people who believe disabilities must be obvious. Few residents knew that 3 years earlier Amelia had survived a violent car accident that left permanent neurological damage. Although surgeons had repaired broken bones and physical scars eventually faded, her brain never fully recovered from the trauma. She suffered unpredictable seizures, episodes of sudden disorientation, and severe balance problems triggered without warning. Doctors eventually determined that she qualified for a professionally trained medical alert service dog. Atlas had undergone nearly 2 years of specialized training before being matched with Amelia. He could recognize subtle neurological changes nearly 15 minutes before a seizure occurred. He could guide her safely to the ground. He could retrieve emergency medication. He could activate specially designed emergency buttons installed throughout her home. He could even bring her phone and bark in a specific pattern that alerted nearby neighbors if Amelia became unconscious. Everything Atlas did had been trained, tested, and certified. But certifications meant very little to people who judged appearances. Willow Creek had become one of the fastest-growing suburban communities outside the city. Beautiful sidewalks curved around artificial lakes. Decorative fountains greeted visitors at every entrance. Families moved there because advertisements promised peaceful living, rising property values, and strict community standards. Those standards were enforced by the HOA board led by its newly elected president, Denise Holloway. Denise viewed rules differently than most people. To her, regulations weren't guidelines. They were weapons. After winning the board election 6 months earlier, Denise had promised to restore neighborhood excellence. Her version of excellence involved measuring grass height with rulers, inspecting holiday decorations with cameras, and issuing violation notices for flower pots painted in colors she considered inconsistent with community aesthetics. Many homeowners quietly complained. Few challenged her directly. Because Denise always insisted, she was simply following the rulebook. The service dog complaint actually began with something remarkably ordinary. Atlas was big. At nearly 80 pounds, the golden retriever naturally attracted attention during morning walks. Children loved him. Elderly residents smiled whenever he gently carried Amelia's grocery bags from the car. But Denise only saw one thing: a large dog. She never bothered asking questions. Instead, she opened the HOA handbook. Page 73 clearly prohibited dogs above a specified weight limit unless individually approved through the Architectural Review Committee, a committee designed primarily for fences and landscaping projects, not federally protected service animals. Without researching disability accommodations, without contacting Amelia, without consulting legal counsel, Denise mailed the violation notice. She considered the matter closed. Meanwhile, Amelia stared at the letter while Atlas rested quietly beside the kitchen table. She had experienced difficult moments before. Hospital rooms, months of rehabilitation, learning to trust her own body again. But there was something uniquely painful about receiving an official demand to separate from the companion responsible for keeping her alive. Atlas sensed her rising anxiety almost immediately. He gently nudged her hand with his nose before placing his head against her knee. The simple gesture slowed her breathing. It always did. Later that afternoon, Amelia calmly called the HOA office. She assumed there had simply been a misunderstanding. Professional service animals were protected under federal law. Surely someone had made an administrative mistake. The receptionist politely transferred her to Denise. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Amelia explained that Atlas was a medically prescribed service dog. She mentioned documentation from physicians. She referenced federal disability protections. She even offered to provide every medical record necessary. None of it mattered. Denise repeated the same sentence several times. The rules apply equally to everyone. Equality sounds noble until it's used to erase fairness. Amelia tried explaining that service animals were legally different from pets. Denise responded that exceptions created dangerous precedents. She insisted every homeowner believed their circumstances deserved special treatment. The fines would begin in 10 days. After the call ended, Amelia sat quietly in her living room while Atlas rested at her feet. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was exhausted. Living with an invisible disability required constant emotional energy. Every grocery trip, every doctor's appointment, every public outing involved proving herself repeatedly to strangers who questioned disabilities they couldn't immediately see. Now even her own neighborhood had become another battlefield. Across Willow Creek, word spread surprisingly fast. HOAs thrive on paperwork. Neighbors thrive on curiosity. By evening, several residents had already heard whispers about Amelia's illegal dog. Most assumed there had to be more to the story. Others immediately sided with the board. After all, rules existed for a reason. Without knowing the facts, opinions multiplied faster than truth. One person who refused to join the rumors was Harold Benson. Harold had lived in Willow Creek since the first homes were built nearly 20 years earlier. A retired firefighter, he had spent decades rescuing strangers without asking whether they deserved help. Experience had taught him something important. Whenever someone in authority claimed to have all the answers, questions usually became more valuable. Harold had watched Atlas accompany Amelia nearly every day. He noticed details others ignored. The dog's constant eye contact. The precise walking patterns. The way Atlas gently blocked Amelia from stepping into streets when traffic approached. This wasn't ordinary pet behavior. Harold quietly visited Amelia the following afternoon. He didn't arrive with opinions. He arrived with homemade soup. Sometimes compassion begins with ordinary kindness. Amelia reluctantly shared the letter. Harold read every word twice. Then he looked at Atlas. The dog calmly remained beside Amelia's chair without moving even once. Years of emergency service instantly recognized disciplined working behavior. Harold didn't need medical records. He knew a trained service animal when he saw one. For the first time since receiving the notice, Amelia felt someone actually understood what was happening. Harold encouraged her not to give up. He believed the board had made a serious mistake. Mistakes could be corrected, but only if someone had the courage to challenge them. Unfortunately, Denise wasn't interested in corrections. The next HOA board meeting included a new agenda item labeled Unauthorized Animal Enforcement. She intended to make Amelia's situation an example for the rest of the neighborhood. Board members received copies of photographs showing Atlas walking peacefully through Willow Creek. The pictures proved nothing except that a large dog existed. Yet Denise presented them as evidence of ongoing rule violations. No one asked whether the animal was legally protected. No one questioned why the owner appeared in every photograph with a medical alert vest visible on the dog's harness. Sometimes people stop seeing what's directly in front of them once they've already decided what they believe. Outside the meeting room, Harold quietly listened through the partially open doors. He realized something deeply troubling. This wasn't about dogs anymore. It wasn't even about HOA rules. It had become about power. And people determined to protect power rarely admit they're wrong voluntarily. Back at home, Amelia received another envelope slipped beneath her front door. This time it wasn't merely a warning. It was an invoice. The first daily fine had already been issued, despite the original deadline not yet expiring. As she looked down at the growing stack of official papers, Atlas suddenly became unusually alert. His posture changed. His breathing slowed. Within seconds, he gently nudged Amelia's arm with increasing urgency. A seizure was coming. She barely managed to reach the sofa before collapsing safely, guided exactly as Atlas had been trained. While the neighborhood argued over HOA regulations, the dog they wanted removed was quietly saving her life once again. And across town, someone unexpected was about to discover what Denise and the HOA had overlooked, something that would transform a simple neighborhood dispute into a case that could shake the entire community. The following morning, sunlight settled gently across Willow Creek as if nothing unusual had happened. Sprinklers watered identical front lawns, parents hurried children toward school buses, joggers followed the winding sidewalks around the neighborhood lake. To most residents, it was another ordinary day. Inside Amelia Carter's home, however, life had become anything but ordinary. The seizure Atlas had warned her about the previous evening had left her physically drained. Every muscle ached. Her head pounded with the familiar exhaustion that always followed an episode. Although she had avoided serious injury because Atlas guided her safely to the couch, recovery still demanded patience. Atlas never left her side. Whenever Amelia stood, he stood. Whenever she rested, he remained close enough to respond instantly if another medical emergency occurred. His training had become second nature. He required no commands, no reminders, no praise. Protecting Amelia was simply his purpose. As she slowly drank a cup of tea that morning, another envelope appeared in her mailbox. Another fine. Another warning. Another demand to remove the unauthorized animal. This time the amount had doubled. The HOA claimed she had ignored their instructions and was now accumulating daily penalties that would eventually become a lien against her property. Amelia quietly placed the letter on the growing pile without opening it completely. She already knew what it would say. She also knew something else. The problem was no longer misunderstanding. It was deliberate. Harold Benson refused to sit quietly. After leaving Amelia's house the previous day, he spent several hours reading federal disability laws, state housing regulations, and legal guidance concerning service animals. The more he read, the more uncomfortable he became. Everything pointed toward one conclusion. The HOA was not simply mistaken. It was violating federal protections that had existed for decades. Harold printed article after article highlighting sections that specifically explained the difference between pets, emotional support animals, and trained service dogs. The distinction was unmistakable. Community associations could create pet rules. They could not simply ignore disability accommodations, especially when a medically necessary service animal was involved. Armed with his research, Harold attended the next HOA board office hours. He expected a conversation. Instead, he found resistance. Denise Holloway barely looked at the documents before sliding them back across the table. "We have attorneys," she said. "Our policies have already been reviewed." Harold remained calm. He had spent 32 years in emergency services. People often became defensive before they became reasonable. "I'm not asking you to break the rules," he replied. "I'm asking you to recognize that federal law comes before neighborhood rules." Denise folded her hands. "If we allow one exception, everyone will demand one." Harold stared at her for several long seconds. Then he asked the question no one else had dared to ask. "What happens if your rules hurt someone?" The room fell silent. Denise offered no answer. Instead, she ended the meeting early. Meanwhile, Amelia decided she could no longer handle the situation alone. She contacted the nonprofit organization that had helped match her with Atlas several years earlier. The organization had spent decades training service animals for veterans, trauma survivors, individuals with epilepsy, and people living with neurological disorders. Their director, Rebecca Lawson, had heard similar stories before. Unfortunately, While service animals were legally protected, discrimination remained surprisingly common. Many people still confused working dogs with household pets. Rebecca listened patiently as Amelia described the HOA notices, the phone calls, and the growing fines. When Amelia finished, Rebecca didn't sound surprised. She sounded concerned. Then she made a promise. "We'll help." Within 48 hours, the organization prepared an official packet. It included Atlas's complete training certification, letters from Amelia's neurologist, documentation describing the dog's medical alert responsibilities, federal housing guidance, state disability protections, professional statements explaining why separating Amelia from Atlas would place her health in immediate danger. Everything was organized professionally. Everything was factual. Everything was impossible to misunderstand. The package was delivered directly to the HOA office. Denise signed for it personally. She never read it. Instead, she forwarded it unopened to the association's property manager with a short email. Continue enforcement. That single decision would eventually become one of the most expensive mistakes the HOA had ever made. Rumors throughout Willow Creek continued growing. Unfortunately, rumors rarely improve with repetition. Some neighbors began whispering that Amelia simply wanted special treatment. Others insisted large dogs frightened children. A few claimed property values would decline if HOA rules weren't enforced equally. None of them had ever spoken to Amelia. None had asked why Atlas wore a working harness. None had witnessed him quietly preventing seizures. They simply accepted the version of events that traveled fastest. But something unexpected happened. A young mother named Sofia Ramirez shared a very different perspective. Several months earlier, while walking with her 6-year-old son near the community pond, she had watched Amelia suddenly lose her balance. Before anyone else realized something was wrong, Atlas gently guided Amelia onto a nearby bench and retrieved a small emergency pouch attached to his vest. The entire incident lasted less than 2 minutes. At the time, Sophia hadn't understood what she was witnessing. Now she did. She began telling neighbors what she had seen. Others slowly remembered similar moments. The elderly couple on Birch Lane recalled Atlas stopping Amelia before she stepped into traffic during a dizzy spell. The mail carrier remembered the dog retrieving dropped packages without being asked. Children remembered how Atlas never accepted treats while wearing his service vest. Piece by piece, a different story began replacing the rumors. People started asking questions. Questions Denise could no longer easily dismiss. The next HOA board meeting drew the largest attendance in years. Normally only a handful of homeowners appeared. This time nearly every chair was occupied. Residents whispered quietly while board members shuffled papers at the front of the room. Denise appeared confident. She expected another routine meeting. Instead, homeowner after homeowner stood during the public comment period. Not to complain about Amelia. To defend her. An elderly veteran described how service dogs had saved fellow soldiers after returning home. A retired nurse explained neurological disabilities to the audience. Parents spoke about teaching children compassion rather than suspicion. Even residents who generally supported strict HOA enforcement admitted something felt wrong. For the first time since becoming board president, Denise faced visible opposition. Still, she refused to reconsider. She insisted the board would continue following established procedures until attorneys advised otherwise. The room grew tense. Harold finally stood. He carried no emotional speech. Only facts. He calmly explained the legal protections governing service animals. He reminded everyone that HOA authority had limits. Then he asked another simple question. If the association loses this case, who pays? Silence. Everyone knew the answer. The homeowners. Not Denise personally. Not the board individually. Every resident's HOA dues would eventually cover legal expenses. Suddenly, the issue became personal for everyone in attendance. Days later, Amelia experienced another seizure. This one happened outside. She had been walking home after collecting mail when Atlas suddenly blocked her path. The dog pressed firmly against her legs, refusing to move. Amelia recognized the warning immediately. She sat down on the nearest patch of grass. Within moments, the seizure began. Fortunately, Atlas had positioned her safely away from the sidewalk. A delivery driver witnessed the entire event. He watched Atlas remain perfectly calm, preventing Amelia from falling onto the concrete while activating an emergency alert button attached to her vest. Paramedics arrived minutes later. One of them smiled when he recognized Atlas. "I know this dog." He had encountered Atlas during a public service demonstration several years earlier. He probably prevented a serious head injury today. Several neighbors witnessed the ambulance. For the first time, they saw with their own eyes what Atlas actually did. He wasn't just accompanying Amelia. He was protecting her every single day. The story spread through Willow Creek faster than any rumor ever had. This time, the truth traveled. That evening, Denise received an unexpected email. It wasn't from a homeowner. It wasn't from the management company. It came from the HOA's own insurance carrier. The insurance representative had become aware of the growing dispute after reviewing incident reports connected to the recent public meeting. The message was short but unmistakably serious. If the association continued enforcement against a medically necessary service animal without proper legal review, insurance coverage for related litigation might be affected. For the first time, Denise hesitated. Not because she believed she was wrong. Because someone else had recognized the financial risk. Yet instead of admitting her mistake, she doubled down once again. The following morning, Amelia received the largest fine yet. The notice included new language threatening legal action if Atlas remained on the property. When Harold read the updated violation notice, he quietly shook his head. He had seen this pattern before. Some people became most dangerous precisely when they realized they were losing. Later that afternoon, Amelia's phone rang. The caller introduced herself as an attorney specializing in disability rights. She had heard about the case through the nonprofit Service Dog organization. After reviewing the documents, she had one question. "Would you allow me to represent you?" Amelia paused. She had spent weeks hoping the HOA would simply recognize its mistake. Now she realized something painful. Some battles ended through conversation. Others required accountability. As she looked toward Atlas sleeping peacefully near the window, she understood that this fight had never been about winning. It had always been about protecting the countless others who might one day face the same discrimination. And across town, inside the HOA office, a certified letter was already making its way toward Denise's desk. By the time she opened it, the conflict would no longer be between one homeowner and one association. It would become a legal challenge capable of changing how every HOA in the county treated people living with invisible disabilities. The certified letter arrived just after 9 o'clock on a quiet Monday morning. Denise Holloway accepted it without concern. Over the previous few weeks, her office had been flooded with emails, complaints, and letters from homeowners who believed the HOA had gone too far. She had dismissed each one with the same confidence that had guided every decision since becoming board president. She expected another complaint. Instead, she unfolded several neatly organized pages bearing the letterhead of a respected disability rights law firm. The first page immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. The association was formally instructed to cease all enforcement actions against Amelia Carter regarding her federally protected service animal. The letter detailed multiple legal violations, documented the HOA's continued refusal to consider medical accommodations, and demanded that all accumulated fines be withdrawn immediately. It also informed the board that if enforcement continued, legal action would follow. Unlike previous warnings, this one included evidence. Copies of the violation notices, medical documentation, records of phone calls, certified delivery confirmations proving the HOA had received and ignored the nonprofit organization's complete documentation. The timeline was impossible to dispute. Every decision had been carefully recorded. Every ignored letter had become another piece of evidence. Denise placed the papers on her desk and stared through the office window. For the first time since the dispute began, uncertainty replaced confidence. News spread quickly through Willow Creek. Not because Amelia announced it. She never sought attention. Instead, homeowners began noticing something unusual. The HOA had stopped sending violation letters. The daily fines suddenly disappeared. The silence was impossible to ignore. Residents who had quietly watched the conflict from a distance now openly discussed it at neighborhood parks, mailboxes, and community events. Many admitted they had assumed the HOA knew the law. Others confessed they had judged Amelia before learning the truth. Several even visited her home personally. Not out of curiosity. Out of apology. One by one, neighbors introduced themselves properly for the first time. Some brought flowers. Others brought meals. Parents encouraged their children to meet Atlas not as a pet, but as a working service dog whose job was saving lives. Amelia accepted every apology with quiet grace. She never criticized those who had misunderstood. She understood something many people never learned. Fear often grows where knowledge is absent. Education changes far more hearts than anger ever could. The HOA scheduled an emergency board meeting. Attendance exceeded every previous meeting in community history. Residents filled every chair. Others stood against the walls. Several local reporters quietly occupied the back of the room after learning about the legal dispute. For months, Denise had controlled every meeting. This evening felt different. The association's attorney addressed the room first. He spoke carefully, professionally, without emotion. He explained that after reviewing the documentation, federal disability law, and the association's enforcement history, he strongly recommended ending all action against Amelia immediately. Continuing the dispute carried significant legal and financial risk. Then came the sentence no board member wanted to hear. In my professional opinion, the association is unlikely to prevail. The room became perfectly silent. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. Some had privately questioned Denise's decisions for weeks but had remained silent. Now the legal reality stood before them. One member finally asked the question everyone had avoided. How much could this cost the homeowners? The attorney answered honestly. If litigation continued, legal expenses alone could reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. Additional damages, attorneys' fees, and settlement costs could increase that amount substantially. Gasps echoed across the room. The issue was no longer about one homeowner. Every family in Willow Creek could eventually pay for one person's refusal to admit a mistake. When public comments began, Harold Benson approached the podium once again. His voice remained calm. He wasn't interested in revenge. He wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. He simply wanted the community to learn. He reminded everyone that rules existed to serve people, not the other way around. Communities became stronger when compassion guided enforcement. Power without understanding created fear. Leadership without humility created conflict. Then he looked directly at the board. The strongest leaders aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones willing to correct them. No one applauded immediately. The silence itself carried more weight than applause ever could. Several days later, the HOA officially withdrew every fine issued against Amelia. Each violation notice was declared void. The association acknowledged Atlas as a protected service animal. A written apology arrived at Amelia's home shortly afterward. It admitted that the board had failed to properly evaluate her accommodation request and expressed regret for the hardship caused. Amelia read the letter carefully. Then she folded it and placed it inside a drawer. Forgiveness, she believed, did not require forgetting. Remembering mistakes prevented them from happening again. The legal case, however, did not simply disappear. Although Amelia no longer faced fines, her attorney explained that important questions remained. The HOA's actions had affected more than one homeowner. Their policies themselves required review. After weeks of negotiations, both sides reached an agreement that extended far beyond Amelia's individual situation. The association agreed to adopt entirely new disability accommodation procedures. Every future board member would receive mandatory training regarding federal housing protections. Requests involving service animals would be evaluated individually rather than automatically rejected under pet rules. The HOA also established an independent review process to ensure future residents received fair consideration before enforcement actions began. Most importantly, every homeowner received educational materials explaining the difference between pets, emotional support animals, and professionally trained service dogs. Knowledge replaced assumptions. Policies replaced confusion. Compassion replaced fear. Months passed. Life slowly returned to normal. Morning walks resumed. Children again waved excitedly whenever Atlas passed. Only now they understood why he never chased tennis balls while wearing his working vest. He wasn't ignoring them. He was doing his job. Teachers at the local elementary school even invited a certified service dog trainer to speak during Disability Awareness Week. Students learned how service animals assisted people with epilepsy, mobility challenges, diabetes, vision loss, and many other invisible disabilities. Several parents later admitted their children had become the greatest teachers at home. Whenever adults casually referred to service dogs as pets, children gently corrected them. Sometimes lasting change begins with the youngest voices. Denise Holloway quietly resigned from the HOA board before the end of her term. She offered no public explanation. Some residents criticized her. Others sympathized. Leadership had become increasingly difficult after homeowners lost confidence in her judgment. She eventually moved to another community. Her departure was peaceful. No celebration followed. Because Willow Creek had learned another important lesson. Justice was not about destroying people. It was about correcting wrongs. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the first violation notice arrived, Willow Creek hosted its annual neighborhood picnic. Families gathered beneath colorful trees. Children played games. Neighbors shared homemade food. For the first time in many years, the atmosphere genuinely reflected the sense of community the neighborhood brochures had always promised. Near the center of the park stood a small information booth sponsored by the nonprofit organization that had trained Atlas. Volunteers answered questions about service animals, disability awareness, and community inclusion. People lined up to learn. Not because they had to. Because they wanted to understand. Amelia stood nearby, smiling quietly as Atlas rested beside her chair. Several neighbors thanked her. Not for winning a legal dispute. For refusing to give up. Her courage had protected future homeowners she would probably never meet. Veterans returning home. Children living with epilepsy. Adults managing invisible disabilities. Families who might one day need accommodations without fear of discrimination. One woman's determination had quietly improved life for countless strangers. As the afternoon drew to a close, a young boy approached Amelia with his parents. He looked at Atlas with admiration. Then he asked the question that seemed almost too simple. Does he know he's a hero? Amelia smiled softly. She looked down at Atlas, whose tail gently brushed the grass as he watched her with the same quiet devotion he had shown every day since entering her life. She reached down and rested her hand on his head. Atlas didn't understand court cases. He didn't understand HOA policies. He didn't understand legal victories or public apologies. He understood only one thing. His person was safe. And for him, that was always enough. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees, Willow Creek looked exactly as it had before the conflict began. The same homes. The same streets. The same sidewalks. Yet something fundamental had changed. People no longer measured their neighborhood by how strictly rules were enforced. They measured it by how compassion was protected. Because a truly beautiful community is never defined by perfectly trimmed lawns or matching mailboxes. It is defined by whether the people living there choose humanity over pride when it matters most. And thanks to one determined woman, one extraordinary service dog, and a community willing to learn from its mistakes, Willow Creek finally became the neighborhood it had always claimed to be.